Well, a very warm welcome to each and every one of you. Now, please remember, these Bible study sessions are just an overview of the book of Revelation. We would be here for many hours if we was to look at every single detail and minutiae of the various different interpretations and nuances of these texts. And I'm just seeking to give an overview, a basic understanding of the book of Revelation to those of you who are listening to these sessions. And today we're at Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 to 17. The Apostle John was a Jew who saw in Jesus of Nazareth the fulfillment of all of God's promises made in the Old Testament. So it's no surprise that the vision he shares with us is full of Old Testament metaphors and imagery. And the chapter we're looking at today consists of three scenes: the woman, the dragon, and the male child who will rule the nations. So let's read our text and then we'll have a look at what it means for us. Revelation 12, verses 1 to 17. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule the nations with an iron scepter, and her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows that his time is short." When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she might fly to a place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times and half a time, out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth the serpent spewed water like a river, to overtake the woman and sweep her away with a torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. So in verse 1, the woman appeared as a sign in heaven, clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, a crown of 12 stars upon her head, and she is pregnant and about to give birth. Now this is not Mary, the mother of Jesus. It's important we realise that. It is Israel, or Zion, as the mother of God's people. The nation of Israel, the people founded by Abraham and his descendants, called to bring God's light into the world by bringing his law and his truth, and eventually the Messiah. That is the woman this passage is talking about. You may remember that Joseph had a dream where the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down before him. In other Old Testament passages, Israel or Zion or Jerusalem is often represented as a woman. Even the Apostle Paul said, "But the Jerusalem that is above is free, and she is our mother." So the 12 stars represent royalty, a royal priesthood, a royal nation, and it also represents the 12 stars of Israel, and the moon under the feet represents the dominion that such people will inherit, the dominion over all things. The Messianic community for centuries had waited for the promise of the Messiah to come, one who would come as one of their own to bring the light of God into the world. Isaiah references this where he says, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you." Now the woman in this passage was about to give birth, and then being with child, she cried out in labour and in pain to give birth. And it's clear that this child born of the nation of Israel, of Zion, of the mother of the people of God, is Jesus. Because we're told in this passage that she bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, which we see in many different passages refer to Jesus of Nazareth. The pain described refers to the travail of Israel at the time of Jesus' birth, because they were under Roman occupation and oppression at that time. And then we see the second image in verses 3 and 4, the dragon. In the Old Testament, Israel's enemies are often metaphorically depicted as monsters. Psalm 74 verse 14, we see Leviathan is Egypt. In Isaiah chapter 27 verse 1, Leviathan is Assyria and Babylon. Ezekiel 29 verse 3 depicts Pharaoh as a predatory monster lying in the streams. And so we see here, then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. Again, we are reminded that this is a sign. The creature here was not literally a great fiery red dragon, but the dragon represented his nature and his character. His description as being red symbolically suggests his fierce power and his murderous nature. And it's a picture of the fallenness of evil in all its hideous strength as we look at the 7 heads, the 10 horns, and the 7 crowns. It is talking about Satan, the archenemy of God. And he's pictured here as a red dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns, and 7 crowns on his head. And we will compare the difference next time in our next session when we look at Revelation 13:1, the beast out of the sea, which had 10 horns, 7 heads, and 10 crowns on the horns. And there's a significant reason why the images there are slightly different, but we'll come on to that next time. But the dragon, Satan, claimed divine royal authority, which is what the 7 heads means, trying to copy God's completeness, for 7 is the number of perfection. The 10 horns, you'll see similarities in Daniel chapter 7 verse 7, and it's clear that the original Roman Empire is in view as John writes here. The 7 heads and 10 horns refer to the original 10 kingdoms, of which 3 were subdued by the little horn of Daniel 7:8. But also this little horn, which Daniel talks about, is also identified with the world ruler of the Great Tribulation, who reigns over a world empire which will be similar to that of the Roman Empire before the return of Jesus Christ to the earth. So John is seeing the Roman Empire of his time, but he's also seeing and understanding that what Daniel teaches and others, that during the end days before Jesus Christ returns, there will come a world empire, a global power, which will deify a man, and that will persecute the kingdom of God. Exactly what the Roman Empire was doing in John's day, the emperor worship, they were deifying the emperors, and great persecutions were breaking out sporadically against the people of God. And John is saying that there will come an end time empire before the second return of Jesus Christ to this world that will have a similar characteristic as that of the Roman Empire. And today we call it the New World Order, which we have touched on briefly at times during these talks. In Daniel, when you look at the prophecies there, he's talking about the New World Order and the Antichrist, and so is John here. This dragon had great power, 7 heads and 10 horns, and claimed royal authority, 7 crowns upon his 7 heads. And as I say, the colour red is symbolic of the murderous nature of this being. Jesus himself said, "You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires." He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. And we see here in our passage in Revelation 12 that his tower swept 1/3 of the stars from heaven and flung them to the earth. This clearly describes the fall of 1/3 of the angelic host who came into league with Satan. That's why in verse 7 and 9 it says the devil and his angels, that 2/3 of the angels stayed loyal to God. But Satan, so deceptive and manipulated had he become when he fell. And we'll look at Satan's 4 falls in just a short while. But so manipulative and deceptive had he become that he was able to convince 1/3 of the angels to rebel against the very one who had created them. And we see that the dragon is waiting to devour the child of Zion. In other words, the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. This was initially fulfilled by Herod's attempts to kill Jesus as a child. But it was also fulfilled throughout Jesus' life and ministry as Satan attacked him at various times. And we know he did succeed in killing him, but that was all part of God's plan for Jesus to go to the cross. But sticking to this text just for the moment, this army of angelic beings in league with Satan, it makes up the world of demonic spirits. Now Jesus' ministry here is described by its earthly beginning and end in a very succinct term, that the woman bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, talking about Jesus. And her child was caught up to God and his throne. This is talking about the ascension. So we see the birth of Jesus, and we see his ascension when he finally, victoriously, is snatched up back to the throne of God. Ruling the nations with a rod of iron refers to the triumphant return of Jesus Christ, as talked about in the 2nd Psalm verse 9 and also later on in Revelation chapter 19 verse 15. But then John then shows us a picture of the last days. The woman is also Israel, the nation, the people of promise. And it's also all believers, whether they are Jewish believers or Gentile believers, those who believe in the Messiah. That is who the woman is in this passage. It's the reborn nation of Israel, which was rebirthed on May the 14th, 1948. But it is also the Church of Jesus Christ in its many different forms today, made up of Jewish people who descend directly from Abraham, and made up of Gentile believers who have been grafted into the people of God. The times and half a times we've looked at before is the 1,260 days, the second period of it. That, remember, the Great Tribulation, the last 7 years of this earth's history, according to the book of Revelation, will last for 7 years. At the 3.5 year point, the Antichrist will set himself up in the newly rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, and he will proclaim himself as God. And a systematic persecution will break out against all believers, and also against the inhabitants of the then nation of Israel. We see here conflict in heaven at the middle point of the Great Tribulation, at this 3.5 year period. A war between Michael and the dragon and the angels on both sides. We see that in verses 7 and 8. Now, Satan is the counterpart of Michael, who seems to be the chief angel opposite the chief of fallen angels, Satan. The letter of Jude also mentions a conflict between these two. But by force, Satan tries to reclaim his place in heaven, but he is being resisted by Michael, the guardian of Zion, the guardian of Israel. He's called in Daniel chapter 21, which means the guardian of the people of God, but also the guardian of the state of Israel, the nation of Israel. But Satan and his angels were not strong enough, and they lost, and they are cast out of heaven, we are told in this passage, that the great dragon was cast out. And in verse 9, the single verse uses many different titles for our spiritual enemy, including dragon, serpent of old, the devil, Satan, and he who deceives the whole world. And these titles are basically describing Satan as being vicious, an accuser, an adversary, and a deceiver. Remember, Satan put it in the heart of Judas to betray Jesus, which was part of the plan to devour this male child. He was the one who tried to undermine the faith of Peter. Jesus himself said, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, which means Satan had access into the presence of God. Paul warns us several times of the nature of the powers we fight against, of the evil devices, and he warns us that he deceived Eve by his cunning. The Bible describes 4 different falls for Satan. In Ezekiel 28:14-16, where he fell from being glorified to becoming the profane creature and being that the Bible talks about. And here we see that he falls from having access to heaven, which you'll see in various different passages like Job 1:12, 1 Kings 22:21, Zechariah 3:1, that he had access into the presence of God. But here he loses it. The third fall the Bible talks about of Satan is from the earth to bondage in the bottomless pit for 1,000 years, which Revelation 20 talks about, and then from the pit to the lake of fire, which also Revelation 20 talks about, which we will come to. But remember, Jesus said, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. This refers to the first fall of Satan, that Jesus is saying, I was there at the time when I saw Satan fall from being the glorified being he was to the profane being he is now. And in that context, Jesus was telling the ones he had sent out to preach his gospel that I've given you authority over Satan and all of his dominion of angels. Some say that Jesus was also looking prophetically to the second fall at the midpoint of the 7-year tribulation period. But the point is, his angels were cast out with him. Then in verses 10-12, we see a joyful declaration in heaven that John heard a loud voice saying. We're not told who this loud voice is, but it appears to be one of the redeemed saints, because the voice speaks of the accuser of our brethren. So it was somebody who was part of the people of God. that the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down. Satan's work of accusing in heaven ends here when he is cast out from his access to heaven. You see, that will happen at the halfway point of the Great Tribulation, at the 3.5 year points. That's why today we still need an intercessor and an advocate, as Hebrews 7:25 and 1 John 2:1 tells us. That when Satan was accusing us, Jesus was praying for us and saying, no, I've paid the price for that person's sin. And we're told about the victory of the saints over Satan here, and there's 3 keys to the victory of every Christian over the great accuser, Satan. Firstly, they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb. The blood overcomes Satan's accusations because it cleanses us from all sin. It washes us clean, it purifies us. The price has been paid. Jesus paid the penalty for our sin. They overcame him by the word of their testimony. The word of their testimony overcomes Satan's deception. Knowing and remembering the work of God in our lives protects us against Satan's lies, which are always trying to take us away from that place in which God has called us and wants us to serve him with the word of our testimony. As faithful witnesses, we have a testimony to bear. We know what we have seen and experienced of God. And then it says they overcame him because they did not love their lives to the death. Loving not their lives overcomes Satan's violence. In other words, if they do not cling to their earthly lives, then there really is no threat Satan can bring against a person. He cannot harm them spiritually because they are cleansed by the blood of Jesus Christ. If we hold to the word of God and the word of our testimony, he cannot lead us back into deception, because the word of God will always shine a light to us and will always set us free. And then if physical violence comes against us to end our lives, even that will not defeat us, because to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, the Apostle Paul says. And so the Christians of the end time will realise they're facing imminent death by this world superpower persecuting the people of God. But they're willing to hold firm to the testimony of Jesus, and they love that life which is to come more than the temporary one which we have in the here and now. Would we love our lives to the death if we were faced with such persecution? Or will our physical lives be the most precious thing to us? Or will we find our life by losing it for Jesus, which he himself said? But then in verses 13 to 17, we see conflict on the earth. Satan attacks the woman. Remember, the people of God and the nation of Israel. And God protects them. So remember, the woman is the people of God, as in the Christian community, both Jews and Gentiles. But it's also referring to the nation of Israel, reformed according to biblical prophecy. He persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child, which was the Jewish community of the time of Jesus, and what was then the state and nation of Israel, which was sent to the wilderness for many years until it was reformed. Remember, God protects his own. Exodus 19:4 says, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." The eagle wings are symbolic of divine protection and preservation that will happen during the second half of the Great Tribulation. And we'll close with this. The flood of ungodliness hurled against the people of God is the river of lies that will come against the truth of God in the end times. And my goodness, aren't we seeing that in our own day and age. The very core concepts of what it means to be a man and a woman, the very core concepts of marriage, the very core concepts of the nature of this world, all of these are being undone by the rivers of lies that are pouring out from Satan and his followers' mouths. And when the Christian church speaks the truth of God, don't we ourselves find a reaction and a kickback and a persecution already? If it's not a physical persecution in some countries yet, it certainly is a social persecution. People can be kicked off social media for saying certain things, or they can be isolated. They can even be sent to a court of law for certain things which may be said. Now, you see, we are seeing these things happening. What the Bible talks about is already happening in our own day and age. But as it says in Isaiah 59, verse 19, when the enemy comes in like a flood, the Spirit of the Lord will raise up a standard against him. Even in this great tribulation period that John is referring to here. And as I say, there is a shadow where he's referring to the whole of church history and every persecution throughout history, but specifically there is also a reference here to this great tribulation because of the number of days that it actually mentions. But even in the end time, Jesus will continue to build his church. And that's why it talks about the rest of the offspring. It's talking about those who will come to Christ during that period of world history, during this great tribulation. Satan wars against those who hold to the testimony of Jesus and obey what God calls them to do. But that's the very way we overcome him, is by doing what God has told us to do and holding to the word of our testimony about Jesus of Nazareth, and not being silenced or given in about it, even in so much as we do not love our lives so much that we'd rather be silent about Jesus than speak for him. But that we will speak up for him, even if it means this earthly life is cut short, because these are the ways this passage tells us how not just the end time generation, whoever they may be, could be us, may not be, but how any Christian can win in the spiritual warfare hurled against the church and hurled against us is because of the blood of the Lamb washing us clean from all sins, and those accusations can be brought against us before the throne of God. Holding to the word of our testimony about who Jesus Christ is, and realising that if it comes to it, a choice between denying who Christ is or losing our life in this world, well, I personally hope in that time, if it ever comes, that God will give me the strength to hold on to my testimony about Jesus. And actually there have been times in my life where I have been faced with that choice and I overcame it. And I hope in the future that the similar may happen. But we'll end our session today there. And next time we will look at Revelation chapter 13 and the beast that comes out of the sea and the land, two beasts there. And we will look at what imagery and metaphors that means and how it may apply to us as the people of God. God bless you.